Let's take our monthly look at the GPU market. Let's start with the Nvidia lineup, then we'll look at AMD and Intel, and then I'll start to give some thoughts on if you did have to buy right now, what would be the best pick at each price point, even if everything's way above MSRP right now. The lowest end GPU in the Nvidia lineup currently is the RTX 5050. It's coming in at $290 minimum, goes up from there, and it is meant to have a $250 MSRP, so we're looking at about $50 over MSRP. The RTX 5060 is meant to be the $300 GPU in the Nvidia lineup. However, it's currently coming in at a minimum of $340 and goes up quickly from there. So again, about $40 to $50 over MSRP on most models. It's still an 8GB card. The 5060 Ti 8GB version is coming in at $380 and goes quickly up over $400 past that point, but it is meant to have about a $380 MSRP. So compared to MSRP, it's the least marked up GPU in Nvidia's lineup, but it's an 8GB card for nearly $400, and it has enough actual raw horsepower to run a lot of the higher graphic settings in the latest AAA showcases, but doesn't have the VRAM to necessarily do so. So it's got a bit of a fundamental flaw if you're trying to crank the graphic settings in AAA games, as opposed to like turning down settings in multiplayer shooters, that kind of thing. Now, the 5070, wait a minute, I skipped the 5060 Ti 16GB. And so did NVIDIA's production line, I believe. So let's take a look. The 5060 Ti does have a 16GB version, and it's coming in at a minimum of $570 compared to its MSRP of $430. So this is a huge markup compared to the 8GB version. Now, it's nice to get the 16GB, but you're paying way too much for this. It's pushing into the price range of a RTX 5070. So I would just say don't consider buying the 5060 Ti 16GB in the current market. Now, the RTX 5070 is meant to be $550, but is currently coming in at a minimum of $625. Now, again, that's close enough to that 5060 Ti 16GB, where I think between the two, it makes sense to get the additional performance of the RTX 5070 if you're going to go with the NVIDIA lineup. We'll look at AMD here in just a second. But again, it's still $70 over its MSRP, and it is a 12GB graphics card. So I think that's one of the reasons we don't see quite as bad of a markup as the 16GB card, is because it has less VRAM. And a huge reason why prices are above MSRP right now is because of the soaring price of memory. Now, the 5070 Ti is where things start to go completely off the rails from a value proposition. The 5070 Ti is meant to be a $750 GPU, and the vast majority of them are costing around $1,000 now. Now, I do see this one listed at $900, but that looked like a fake Amazon listing. Anyway, that's still quite a bit of money. So they're mostly $250 over MSRP currently. Now, if you try to go up to the 5080, you now are hitting $1,300. So it's basically a 30% price increase to go with the 5080 over the 5070 Ti, but the 5080 is only about 15% faster. So definitely diminishing returns. They have the same amount of VRAM, and the 5070 Ti was already a pretty bad value. So 5080 is really not offering you value. And then the 5090 is coming in at almost $4,000. And so, you know, if you're the kind of person who can spend $4,000 on your hobby without blinking, without missing a rent payment, without going into debt, you know, you could consider it. It is significantly more powerful than even a 5080, but it's a lot of money. It's just out of most people's considerations. Now, let's take a look at the Intel lineup really quick. So the Arc B570 is coming in at $260. And the B580 is coming in at $300. At these price points and the low availability, I don't think they make a lot of sense, at least in the US market. By the way, I'm looking at the US market today and sorting prices low to high from a bunch of retailers using PC Part Picker. If you live in other regions, your pricing could be different, and so could your availability. Now let's look at AMD's lineup. The RX 9060 XT is the lowest end of their current lineup, and they're coming in at $355 and up when meant to have an MSRP of $300. That's the 8 gigabyte version. The 16 gigabyte version is meant to have a $350 MSRP, but is coming in at $440, which is a significant markup. But notice that this is significantly less expensive than the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte from Nvidia, which is the competing product. So I'll definitely be coming back to this one when I talk about, so what should you buy if you have to buy something right now in the current market. The RX 9070 is currently coming in at $600 and up, meant to be a $550 card by MSRP. And the XT version is coming in at $700 and up, but that is a performance competitor with the 5070 Ti, which is currently sitting at around $1,000. So at least it's not that. It's meant to have a $599 MSRP, but they've generally been hard to find at that price ever since launch. Okay, so that's how all of the latest generation products cost in the current lineups. So yeah, where would you be buying if you absolutely had to buy right now? Well, like I mentioned a second ago, the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte version is the one I'm going to call out for if you want to play graphic settings turned up at 1080p or 1440p, especially if you play the latest like AAA single player games. This has similar kind of performance to something like the PlayStation 5 Pro, that kind of thing. It has access to FSR 4 upscaling, which is very competitive with the latest versions of DLSS upscaling. Nvidia's frame generation is still more advanced with better frame pacing and multi-frame generation available. But AMD's actual upscaling, which does improve performance by lowering the internal rendering resolution, has gotten a lot more competitive. It does a pretty good job here, and this GPU has about the same performance as a 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte. To back up those claims, let's take a look at Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart, and we'll look at the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte version and how it stacks up relative to some other GPUs. So this is similar in performance to a 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte, which is generally about 5% faster on average. Even in most ray tracing workloads, they're fairly competitive. In the most advanced path tracing workloads, some games have been NVIDIA exclusive on that, and when they're not, it is a performance advantage for the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte. However, that card is a little bit weak for path tracing, in my opinion, so I wouldn't make too much out of that. So I would prefer the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte if you offered to me them at the same price, because it has slightly more performance, it has a better feature set, and they have the same amount of VRAM. However, in the current market, that's where we've got to talk, right? Because it's $440 for the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte, and the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte is $570. So $570 versus the $440 is a pretty big difference. So 570 divided by 440 is a 30% price increase. So the 5060 Ti 16 gigabyte costs 30% more than its direct competitor from AMD. In absolute terms, it's $130 more. We're talking somebody buying something for way less than $500, right? Closer to $400 than $500 versus something that's closing in on $600. These feel very different from the end consumer perspective. So at that point, I've got to say that the 9060 XT 16 gigabyte isn't something I love at $440, but just in the current landscape of badly priced GPUs, I would say that if you're looking for something under $500 that can play all the latest games at 1080p or 1440p, has a good feature set for doing that and enough VRAM to not have headaches regarding that, I would say that this stands out as a reasonable pick in that kind of situation if you have to buy a GPU right now. Now, speaking of if you have to buy a GPU right now, that's another reason why we should look at this relative performance chart, because if you already have a card like a 3070 Ti that's basically the same performance anyway, but you would just be getting more VRAM. Probably not worth the expense right now, although you could sell your old card to help you, pay for the upgrade. The similar performance like an RX 6800. It's a little faster than a 2080 Ti, but not by much, and that already had a decent amount of VRAM. Those kinds of things. So you can see the relative performance of similar cards. If you already have like an RTX 3080, you already have a faster GPU already, even if you would gain a little bit more VRAM. So think about that before deciding if you want to upgrade. I would make sure you're getting a significant noticeable upgrade if you're spending this amount of money. Now, what about other stuff in the current lineup? Man, it's hard to recommend anything at the low end, so let's talk high end for a second. I already mentioned, okay, 5090 at $4,000 is nothing to you, okay? I mean, that rules out the vast majority of people. So if we're not buying a 5090 for the high end, what else is there? I already said the 5080 doesn't make sense compared to the 5070 Ti from a value proposition. Here's what I mean. If we set the 5070 Ti as the baseline, we are getting a card that compares with the 5080 at about 15% performance difference. My own testing lines up with Tech PowerUp's numbers here. It's about a 15% performance advantage for the 5080. They both have 16 gigabytes of VRAM. They both have the same feature set. So there's not really any value argument for getting the 5080. 15% more performance is not particularly noticeable. For example, if you were already getting 60 FPS and you got a 15% performance increase, that would get you to 69 FPS. And while 69 is nicer than 60, it's also not like super meaningful difference in your overall experience playing the game. You know, this would take a 70 FPS game to 80.5 FPS. This would take a 40 FPS experience to 46. So it doesn't take you from like a not very playable situation to suddenly having a very playable situation. So in other words, these are not worlds apart. They roughly can get you a broadly similar performance in specific games. So I don't think the 5080 makes any sense. Now, how about the 5070 Ti? So the 5070 Ti, again, most models coming in at $1,000. Okay, that stacks it up against what about AMD's alternative with the 9070 XT? So the 9070 XT is $700. Let's take a look at that. So we're talking $1,000 versus $700. It's like a 43% difference in price. We can call it 40. So 40% more money. Now let's look at the performance differences. So if we set the 9070 XT as the baseline, the 5070 Ti is generally single-digit percentages faster, 5% or so. In path tracing, though, there are some exclusive titles to Nvidia right now that just launched, like Pragmata, Resident Evil Requiem. I hate that they're currently vendor-locked like that, but they are. So if you're interested in path tracing in the latest single-player games, there is that argument for the 5070 Ti. You also, like I said, get better frame generation situation on the Nvidia side of things if you're interested in frame generation. Both GPUs have the same amount of VRAM, but again, they have a broadly similar performance in most situations, meaning, personally, I don't think it makes any sense to spend an extra 40% or like $300 on a GPU that gets broadly the same experience in the vast majority of gaming situations. So I don't think the 5070 Ti makes sense either. So that leaves us with the 9070 XT as a high-end GPU. Should we even consider that one if we're looking at a value perspective? Well, let's take a look again. So the 9070 XT, if we're saying it's better value than the 5070 Ti, how does it compare to the ones that are actually closer in its price range, like the 9070 non-XT and the 5070? Well, let's look at the 9070 against the 9070 XT. So it's about $100 price difference, 700 versus 600. So if we look at 700 versus 600, you're spending about 17% more money on the XT version. Now, what do you get for the 17% more money? Performance-wise? Well, if we set the 9070 non-XT as the baseline, we are seeing that you're getting 12% more performance for about 17% more money, in which case there's like the very slightest bit of diminishing returns, but not by much. So they offer actually broadly similar value. Yeah, the non-XT version is technically slightly better performance per dollar, but not by much. So if I'm comparing these two GPUs, it would mostly come down to Do you have the extra $100 and want to get a little bit more GPU performance for it? They offer about the same performance per dollar. So that's kind of the breakdown there. I think if you're considering a 9070 or a 9070 XT, either one makes sense if you have the budget for it, if you're looking at them against each other. So if the other NVIDIA GPU kind of in this broadly similar performance class is the 5070. So 5070 is a 12 gigabyte card, whereas the 9070 and 9070 XT are 16. Now 12 is still good in the vast majority of situations at 1080p and 1440p, and usually you could turn down like one setting slightly if you were going over 12 gigabytes, and you'll be okay, although there's some question about the longevity there. Also, NVIDIA's feature set does seem to have proven to hold up pretty well over time as well, though, so that's another thing to factor in. Now the 5070, okay, so we drop down to 12 gigabytes. The 9070 is 10% faster and the XT is 23% faster. Now, how do they hold up from a value proposition in terms of performance per dollar? So if we look back at the 5070, so the 5070 is coming in at $625. So if we look at 600, sorry, let me clear these. So 600 divided by, sorry, I'm totally spacing out. First, let's compare to the 9070 XT actually. So 700 divided by the 625, you're basically spending 12% more money if you get the 9070 XT version instead of the 5070. Okay, so 5070 versus 9070 XT, 12% more money to go the AMD route, but the AMD route would also get you 23% more performance and 16 gigabytes of VRAM. So honestly, I think between the two, I would rather have a 9070 XT than a 5070, even though I'm losing the NVIDIA feature set. I am getting more raw performance and more VRAM. And the 9070 XT even keeps up pretty well in ray tracing. It's only path tracing where it falls a little bit behind, and the 5070 like could do path tracing if you're okay with like kind of lowish frame rates before using frame generation. I wouldn't take it as a real major selling point on the 5070 personally. So I think that honestly, I think I'd probably lean 9070 XT here at that kind of a difference, right? 12% more money for 23% more performance and the additional VRAM. Now, how does it stack up against the 9070? Well, the 9070 is 10% more powerful, but actually costs a little bit less and has more VRAM. So that's also interesting. So I'm gonna be 100% honest here. At this like $600 to $700 price range where all three of these GPUs fall, I think you could make an argument for the 5070, the 9070, or the 9070 XT. I could respect somebody making any of those decisions. So I'm not gonna come out here and just say like, this is the one you should buy. I'm just saying the AMD GPUs are offering a bit more performance per dollar and more VRAM. The NVIDIA GPU is offering the NVIDIA feature set, but with reduced VRAM and a little bit less performance. So in that kind of a situation, like I said, you can kind of value those features personally and make your call. So high-end GPUs, I think it's really more like upper mid-range, but the highest-end GPUs that make any sort of value proposition are the 5070, the 9070, and the 9070 XT, and you can weigh those slight differences and make that pick for yourself. So talked about the highest-end GPU that makes any sense. We've talked about kind of the mid-range GPU that makes any sense. Are there any budget GPUs that make any sense? Well, remember, we have the 5050 coming in at about $300, and we have the 5060 coming in at $340, and then we have the 5060 Ti 8GB already pushing up to almost $400, in which case I'd probably go with the 16GB 9060 XT. So what does that leave us with? We got the 9060 non-XT at like $350. That doesn't feel that great either. Like, I'm gonna be honest, guys, I don't really recommend any of these GPUs. You could just pick one and go for it. You could buy something in the used market that's probably better for under $400. Or you could hope that something happens and the GPU market changes. Other than that, like, I mean, we can compare their relative performance and see how these things stack up. I don't think I'd want to buy a 50-50. The 50-50, if we want to take a look at that, if we set the 50-50 as the baseline, let's say you went with the 50-60. You are getting about 30% more performance. So if I'm comparing the 50-60 and the 50-50, and I'm looking at this kind of pricing, again, the 50-50 is almost $300. The 50-60 is about $340. So you're spending about, $40 more to get the additional almost 30% performance. I think that's worth it. So if I had to choose between the 50-50 and the 50-60, I do think it's worth spending the little bit of extra money to get the 50-60. Now, if we're looking at the 5060 against the 5060 Ti, though, the 5060 Ti version, 8GB version, is only about 15% more powerful, so might not make that much sense to do that additional upgrade if you're trying to stay as low budget as possible. Now, we could also compare this with the 9060 8GB version, XT 8GB version, but that's not that much faster than the 5060. It's kind of annoying here, right? So I don't really love any of these. I mean, you could kind of pick a little bit more money and go up with this one, but then, like I said, you're getting close to that 16GB 9060 XT. All I've got to say is that I'd really personally only feel comfortable saying to try to go up to that 9060 XT 16GB version, and if you can't, probably avoid the 5050, but you could kind of pick your poison between the 5060, 5060 Ti, and 9060 XT 8GB based on what you value out of those options. All of them are going to make a decent, like, esports type card where you're not turning up graphics settings. So, I mean, there's that. And like I said, maybe check out the used market and see if you can find something in your price point that does a little bit better. All right, that's the current market. I wish I had better news for all of you, and we currently have no idea when or if things will start to improve with memory pricing. So it is what it is. That's what we've got for you in May. Come back next month and we'll take a look and see if things are hopefully any better. Hope all of you have an excellent day.